Western Australia has more land than any country in Western Europe. The entire population of a mid-sized city, spread across 2.5 million square kilometers of desert, coast, and emptiness. Most of that territory has never been properly surveyed. Most of it has never needed to be. But buried inside that silence is something that took a long time to understand. There are places out here that don't just feel forgotten. They feel deliberately left behind. And the further you go into this list, the harder it gets to believe that was an accident. Some of these places still appear on maps. Others were quietly removed from them. This video found both kinds. There's a pub still open in Kukini. That's the first thing you notice. One pub, a handful of buildings, maybe a dozen permanent residents, and all around it, the bones of a town that once held close to 3,000 people. Kukini was a gold rush settlement. It erupted out of the Western Australian interior in the late 1890s, when prospectors started pulling serious color from the ground. By 1903, it had hotels, a school, a racecourse. It had ambition. The kind of ambition that makes people build race courses in the middle of nowhere. Then the gold thinned out. And within a generation, almost everyone left. What stayed is strange in a specific way. Not derelict exactly. More like paused. The pub operates because there are still stations in the area, still travelers on the goldfields roads. But the rest of it sits there in the heat, stone walls softening back into the ground. And you get this feeling that the town never quite accepted that it was over. There's a headstone out near the edge of the old settlement. A child. 7 years old when the town was still alive. Nobody in particular remembered her name when they moved on. That's how Kukini starts to tell its story, through the things nobody took with them. 40 kilometers from Kukini, almost close enough to feel like the same story. There's a place called Gwalia. And Gwalia is different because it didn't just fade. It stopped, almost completely intact. The Sons of Gwalia mine operated here from 1897. At one point, it was one of the most productive gold mines in the colony. The manager's residence is still standing. The workers' camp is still there. Herbert Hoover, yes, that Herbert Hoover, the one who became President of the United States, managed this mine in 1898. He was 24 years old, fresh out of Stanford, and he was here, in the Western Australian desert, running logistics for an operation that was pulling gold out of ancient rock. He left after a year. The mine kept going until 1963. When it finally closed, it closed fast. The men walked off shift and didn't come back. Furniture stayed in the houses. Tools stayed in the workshops. It's one of the best preserved ghost towns in Australia. Which sounds like a good thing until you stand inside one of those houses and realize you're looking at someone's interrupted life. A cup on a shelf. A chair pulled out from a table. Nobody finished what they were doing. They just stopped. Drive east along the Nullarbor and eventually you drop down the Madura Pass, cross into the very edge of WA, and arrive at Eucla, a tiny roadhouse community sitting on the edge of the Great Australian Bight. There's a petrol station, a motel, not much else. But walk down toward the coast and you find what's actually here. The old Eucla telegraph station was built in 1877, part of the overland telegraph system that connected Perth to the rest of Australia. For a brief period, it was critical infrastructure, one of the key relay points for messages crossing the continent. It had staff quarters, a weather observation post, a full operational establishment in the middle of nowhere. Then the sand came. Over decades, the dunes migrated. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just slowly, persistently, the way sand does. By the time the station was decommissioned in 1927, the dunes were already swallowing the walls. Now the ruins sit half buried, with sand packed into the windows and pressing against what's left of the stonework. There's something genuinely unsettling about it. Not because it looks dangerous or dramatic. It's almost peaceful. It's unsettling because the landscape is winning so completely, so patiently, and there's nothing left to even slow it down. The station transmitted its last message, and then the desert began to reclaim the walls, stone by stone. Nobody stopped it. Nobody was meant to. Most people know the fence. The rabbit-proof fence, or state barrier fence, was constructed starting in 1901, stretching nearly 3,400 kilometers across Western Australia, longest fence in the world, built to stop the eastward spread of rabbits and other pests into farmland. An extraordinary piece of colonial engineering by any measure. What fewer people know are the inspection posts. Along the length of the fence, small stations were built for the fencers, the men who walked its length, checking for damage, repairing breaches. These weren't proper towns, just structures. A small building, a water tank, a place to sleep before walking on. Some of them are still standing along remote sections of the fence. Some have collapsed into the spinifex. The fence still exists, still monitored, still partially functional. But the posts are abandoned. The fencers don't walk it the same way anymore. And there's another part of this that the fence carries, heavier than its practical history. The same fence, or the path it followed, was used as a navigation route by Aboriginal children removed from their families under the assimilation policies of the early 20th century. The film made about that walk is well known. Less known is what it felt like to follow a fence line for weeks through the desert just to get home. The posts sit in the scrub now. Quiet. There's a lot those walls witnessed that never got written down. The northwest coast, Pilbara country. There's a place called Cossack that was, for a short period, the most significant port in the north of Western Australia. It was established in 1863. Pearl luggers operated out of here, along with pastoral supply vessels servicing the stations being carved out of Kimberley country. At its height, it had a courthouse, a bond store, a jail, residences, proper colonial infrastructure built from the local red stone. The port silted up. The pearling industry shifted north. A new port at Roebourne became more practical. And Cossack, which had been built with such obvious confidence in its own future, was simply left. The buildings are still there. The courthouse, the bond store, the jail. All that red stone sitting in the coastal heat, slowly bleaching. A ghost town that looks more like a stage set. Too intact to feel natural, too empty to feel real. What makes Cossack stay with you is the scale of the confidence it represented. Whoever built that courthouse wasn't building something temporary. They were building something that was meant to last. And then the commercial logic changed, and the whole thing was abandoned. And now it sits there like an argument that nobody finished having. Laverton is a real town. Small, functional, a service center for the Goldfields region. But Laverton matters in this list because of what it sits beside. The edge of the Gibson Desert and the route into one of the most isolated territories in the country. The Ann Bedell Highway starts near here. Roughly 1,600 kilometers of dirt track cutting through some of the emptiest land on Earth, built by a surveyor named Len Bedell in the 1950s. Bedell worked for the Australian government, and his job, openly stated, was to open up the interior for specific purposes. Remote testing, defense infrastructure, things that needed space and distance. Laverton is where bitumen ends and something else begins. There are stations out along those tracks that have been abandoned. Pastoral operations that lasted a generation or two, then couldn't sustain themselves economically. Homesteads sitting empty in the mulga scrub. Some of them have been out there long enough that the original occupants are dead, their children are old, and the structures are just quietly falling apart with nobody watching. Nobody much comes this way without a purpose. And the purposes that brought people out here weren't always the kind that get talked about openly. This one takes some explaining because it's not one place. It's a pattern. The Kimberley, the far northwest of Western Australia, was opened up for pastoral leases in the 1880s. Enormous stations, some of them covering more than 1 million acres. Names like Fossil Downs, Glenroy, Noonkanba. Some of them are still operating. Some of them aren't. What happened on those stations, across those decades, is a complicated and uncomfortable history. Aboriginal labor, largely unpaid, coercive in practice if not always in law, built and maintained those pastoral empires. People were bound to country that had been theirs for tens of thousands of years, but now existed inside a legal framework that made them workers on someone else's property. When the pastoral industry contracted, when beef prices fell, when mechanization changed the economics, when some stations simply became unviable, people were removed. Communities that had existed on those stations for generations were dispersed. Some of the homesteads closed. The infrastructure remains in various states of decay across Kimberley country. Driving through some of that country today, you pass ruins that are two kinds of ruin at once. The physical decay of abandoned buildings, and something older underneath. The quiet of country that remembers things the official record didn't see fit to include. Before the air highway was sealed, crossing the Nullarbor meant following a rough track between pastoral stations that served as the only points of water and shelter across the plain. Mundrabila was one of them. The highway changed everything. Once the route was sealed and service infrastructure was purpose-built, the old stations that had functioned as waypoints became economically irrelevant almost overnight. The highway ran close enough that travelers didn't need them, but not close enough to bring new business. Some of those old way stations are still visible from the highway. Sheds, tanks, fence lines. The ghost of a function that the road made obsolete in less than a decade. There's something almost too clean about that story. The way progress moves through a landscape and leaves its old versions behind without ceremony. The Nullarbor doesn't sentimentalize, it just absorbs. Here's where the tone changes. Wittenoom isn't a place that was forgotten. It's a place that the government of Western Australia spent considerable effort trying to make people forget. There's a difference. Blue asbestos was mined at Wittenoom from the 1930s until 1966. At its peak, the town had close to 2,000 residents, families, schools, the full infrastructure of a working community. The mining company knew early that there were health concerns about blue asbestos. The concerns were documented internally. The town kept operating. By the time the mine closed, the contamination was everywhere. In the streets, in the soil, in the lungs of people who'd breathed that dust for years. The deaths started coming in the 1970s. Mesothelioma, asbestosis, cancers that take decades to develop and kill you slowly when they arrive. Hundreds of former residents. The numbers are still accumulating. Western Australia formally depopulated Wittenoom in the 2000s, removed it from official maps, cut off its power and water. The goal was to remove any reason for people to go there, and to reduce the liability that came with people dying of exposure-related illnesses on what had been government-serviced land. There are people who still live there, a handful. They refuse to leave. The government doesn't acknowledge them officially. The roads into Wittenoom are marked with contamination warnings. The buildings are still standing. You can go there if you want to, and you'll drive through what looks like a normal, slightly decayed country town. Except the dust around you is the reason so many people are dead. That's not metaphor. That's literally what's in the soil. Western Australia, during the space race, was extremely valuable. The geography was right. Southern Hemisphere, relatively clear of urban light and radio interference, positioned to track spacecraft in orbits that couldn't be covered from the Northern Hemisphere alone. A network of tracking stations was built across the state. Honeysuckle Creek, Muchia, Island Lagoon was over the border in South Australia, but stations in WA were part of the same network. Places like Carnarvon, which tracked early Apollo missions and relayed signals from the lunar surface. Some of those stations are museums now. Carnarvon has preserved its role in the Apollo program and done it well, but others are just not. The infrastructure was decommissioned, The dishes were removed or left to rust. The support buildings sit in various states of abandonment. What's strange is the conceptual weight of what happened in those places. The signals that came through those receivers, the first steps on the moon passed through some of this infrastructure. And then the mission ended, the technology moved on, and the buildings were just left in the scrub. History doesn't always preserve itself in proportion to its significance. This requires geographic precision, because Maralinga itself is in South Australia. But the contamination, the exclusion zones, and the psychological shadow of what happened there don't respect state borders. British nuclear testing in Australia. 12 major nuclear detonations between 1952 and 1957, plus hundreds of so-called minor trials, involving the dispersal of radioactive and toxic materials, plutonium, beryllium, uranium. The Anangu people whose country this was received no warning, no protection, and no compensation for decades. The cleanup, conducted in the 1990s, was controversial from the start. The contaminated soil was mixed with clean soil to dilute radioactivity rather than properly removed. Areas were declared safe on the basis of assessments that were later challenged. The exclusion zones were drawn around what was politically convenient as much as what was scientifically indicated. The eastern edges of Western Australia sit adjacent to this. The contamination doesn't respect the map lines, and the communities displaced from that country during the testing period, moved away under the pretense of their own protection, never properly returned. That's a story that crosses into WA history, whether or not the detonations technically happened there. There are people alive today who were children when British scientists were scattering radioactive material across their country. Some of them spent years trying to go home and were told it wasn't safe. Some of them are still being told that. Northwest Cape, the very top of the Exmouth Peninsula, pointing into the Indian Ocean like a finger. The Harold E. Holt Naval Communication Station is still operational, so this isn't an abandoned site, but it belongs in this list because of the layers of non-disclosure that have built up around it since it was established in 1967. And because of what those layers say about who controls what in this part of the world. The station was built as a joint US-Australian facility. Its primary function is submarine communication, specifically transmitting extremely low frequency signals to submerged submarines in the Indian Ocean and beyond. It operates at frequencies that penetrate seawater. It can reach submarines that are too deep to surface, too hidden to risk exposure. The original agreement that established it gave the United States effective operational control. Australia hosted the facility. America ran it. The precise terms of that arrangement were classified for years. Some of them still are. There's a small community at Exmouth that exists primarily because of the base. Local businesses, families, a town that wouldn't really be there otherwise. The base defines the geography, and the geography defines what questions you're allowed to ask. Walk out to the antenna field on a clear night. 19 VLF towers, some of them over 300 meters tall. They make a sound in the air, a kind of low hum at the edge of perception. And somewhere under the Indian Ocean, a submarine receives a message that you will never know the content of. That's not paranoia. That's just the operating reality of what's out there. There's an object visible in satellite imagery of the Western Australian interior that has no publicly registered explanation. It doesn't appear on any civilian survey. There's no mining lease associated with it in the publicly accessible registry. No pastoral record. No defense facility acknowledgement. No heritage listing. The coordinates put it in a stretch of country that is, by any conventional measure, completely empty. The structure, and it is a structure, not a geological feature, appears to be a series of parallel earthworks or constructed forms, visible from altitude, covering an area large enough that it couldn't be accidental. Whatever it is, it required machinery. It required planning. It required someone to be out there, doing something deliberate, in a location specifically chosen for its distance from everything else. There are a few explanations that don't require conspiracy. Old pastoral infrastructure, an unregistered mining survey, a defense test of some kind, conducted under classification levels that don't require public disclosure. These are real possibilities. They're worth taking seriously. But here's the thing about Western Australia that this entire list has been building toward. This state is large enough that things can be done inside it without needing anyone's permission to ignore. The distance is the permission. The silence is the clearance. And there's a pattern across these 13 places. A consistent pattern of things being done out here precisely because nobody would ask, and things being left out here precisely because nobody would find them. Koukini, Gwalia, Yukla, the fence posts, Cossack, the stations, Vitanum, the nuclear shadow, the submarine towers. Each one on its own has a reasonable explanation. A gold rush ended. A telegraph became obsolete. An asbestos company made choices it knew were wrong. A government did what governments do. Together they describe something harder to name. A landscape that has been used systematically as a place where the normal rules of visibility don't quite apply. Where the distance from the rest of the country makes certain decisions easier to make and easier to leave behind. And that structure, that unnamed thing in the satellite images, might be the most honest object in this whole list, because at least it doesn't pretend to have a story. It just sits there, in the red nothing, waiting for someone to think it's worth asking about. Most places on this list were found eventually. The stories came out. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely. But they came out. The question, at the end of all of this, isn't what that structure is. The question is how many others are out there, in the parts of the map that nobody's thought to look at yet. Because Western Australia is very large, and the silence is very old, and it has never once run out of room.